Hey, it's Austin James. Yes, I'm living with diabetes, but it doesn't have to define me. Thanks to the Freestyle Libre 3 Plus sensor, I get real-time glucose readings throughout the day. The Freestyle Libre 3 Plus sensor is small and easy to wear, giving me the freedom to focus on my life as a parent and a musician. Now this is progress. You can get a free sensor at freestylelibre.us.
Offer available for people who qualify. Visit myfreestyle.us to see all terms and conditions. Certain exclusions apply. Data on file. Abbott Diabetes Care. Per prescription only. Safety info found at freestylelibre.us.
Green Bay hustle, grind it up. Hit the field, we don't bluff. Touchdown dances, feel the love. Jordan's got that MVP stuff. It's time for OPE. Let's go. Packers bringing that show. It's time for OPE. You know who. Wanna go, gonna blow.
Hey everyone, this is Iowa Joe here. I just wanted to take this moment to explain what this episode is going to be about. I tried to do it in the beginning of the recording, but I don't think I got my message off too well. With this being the off season and with stories just kind of trickling in for the Packers, I figured I would kind of reach out into different topics just for this off season. I think I'm going to title these I kind of mentioned it at the beginning that I'm working on titles, but I think I'm going to go with off-season, off-topics. And basically what I'm going to do is bring in people from different outlooks, from different areas of podcasting, history, wrestling, movies, music, everything else, and just bring them in, talk to them about such a topic, and release those episodes. Don't worry. Mike and I will still be doing Packer content, but when it more starts picking up and when we start getting more storylines like camp and training camp and stuff like that, Mike is not gone. We're still together. We're just trying to come up with shows for you guys to listen to that aren't the same rehashes that every other content creator out there is making. So please enjoy this episode. This is the first episode of Off Season, Off Topic. I talk. You'll hear more about it when the episode plays, but I'm joined by James Townsend from the Billy the Kid Coalition and podcast Chasing Billy. James and I talked for a little over 2 hours. I'm going to try my best to break this episode up into 2 parts. That way you guys don't have to sit here and try to listen for a 2 straight hour thing. So this is going to be part 1 with James Townsend, and then next week will be part 2. Like always, give us feedback. Let us know who you'd like us to talk to. What would interest you. If this episode was good, maybe we can bring James back in and talk a little bit more about that. So I hope you enjoy it. Go Pack Go. Hello, and welcome to OPE, the Ohana Packers Edition podcast. I am Iowa Joe. I have given Mike Kawano a vacation for the next couple of weeks. I figured since we kind of struggle with the off-season episodes, I would just kind of do what I wanted to do, basically, because since I'm the benevolent overlord of the Ohana Packers Edition podcast, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to have the people on I want to have on. This is going to be the first episode of a solid run of what I'm thinking of calling the Ched Talk, because, Packers, cheddar, cheese, stuff like that. So, yeah, it's a work in progress. But this week, I have on James Townsend of the Billy the Kid Coalition, the host of the Chasing Billy podcast. And basically, because I am what I like to consider an Old West buff myself and a Billy the Kid fan, well, I guess not really fan, but, I love the history of the Billy the Kid thing, because, when people think fan, they think, well, you're a fan of a killer. But hopefully we can break some of them myths here and now with James. James, thank you for joining me on this episode.
Super excited to be here. I appreciate you having me. You said you watched the show, and I love that anyone tunes in and is interested in this history. It's something we all share a passion for, so I'm happy to be here.
And like I told you in my email, I'm really happy that somebody is keeping this stuff going. it's there's too many kids out there that, let's face it, the schooling systems are failing a lot in a lot of areas, and history is one of the things that they're taking out of schools, and you're not learning as much as you did. But you know, this is a part of history. Billy the Kid obviously is a big name. There's a lot of what do you call it? There's a lot of media that is based around Billy the Kid and the stories. And when you think of the Old West, there's like three names that pop up the most: Wyatt Earp, Jesse James, Billy the Kid. So and I think we're probably around the same age, depending on. So I'll be 39 this year, and I was obviously the big movies when we were younger were the Billy the Kid movies, which were Young Guns and Young Guns 2. And I think a lot of people got their love of that from them. But I'm going to tell you a different story of how I got into Billy the Kid, and then I'm going to ask you how you got into Billy the Kid. So I know you are a big genealogy person, just like I'm a big genealogy person. And there
Yeah.
was a story that always ran through with my dad's side of the family that one of his great grandfathers actually rode with Jesse James. So, never found out if there was any possibilities. He's not a known name among the known ones that rode with him, so we don't know about that. But being 10 years old and finding that out, oh my God, I wanted to read everything about, Old West and gunfighters and stuff like that. And of course, Billy the Kid, beings that, he was a kid at that time, really kind of piqued my interest in all that stuff. So, with that telling of that story, James, how is it that you found your way to Billy the Kid?
Well, I had a very good friend in elementary school. His name was Travis, and we're still friends actually. So it's one of those fortunate friendships that last quite a while. And uh, in 1990, I think, when Young Guns 2 came out, I guess his dad wanted to go see it and drug us along because neither me nor my friend really cared or knew anything about Billy the Kid, and I wasn't interested in westerns at that time. I grew up on Star Wars, Back to the Future, Indiana Jones. Those were all my interests, and
Nothing
but
wrong
for
there.
some reason, I don't know. I guess we wanted to get out of the house, so we went and saw this movie, and I had not seen Young Guns 1. Didn't know anything about Billy the Kid. Had never heard even his name. But I was transfixed by that story, and especially the way Young Guns 2 tells it. It's very archetypal. It's very hero's journey, mythological. It really grabs everything that a person loves about a good story. Young Guns 2 does that job. And so, yeah, that was the start of it, and I played Billy the Kid on the playground and with my friends and grew up with Young Guns. But it was always just like anything else, just something you like. It wasn't something I was hugely fascinated with. And truth be told, not until the pandemic, when we all had to kind of stay in our houses, that I kind of got in my head that I wanted to write a novel. And I thought, well, what topic would I write about? What things have mattered to me? What would be a good story? And so I thought, I grew up loving Young Guns and Billy the Kid. I could learn the history of Billy the Kid, the real history, and do a more historical style novel for Billy. So I started researching the history so that I wanted to get to the point where I could tell the story, just rattle it off without consulting any books, without consulting any histories, that I would know it so well that I could just spout it off. And once I could do that, I would be ready to write the novel. And so I studied and read the books and found things in newspapers that I had not found in books. So I contacted Bob Bell and James Mills at True West Magazine, and they put one of my little discoveries in the 2021 issue they did about Billy the Kid, and that kind of got me into the research in the historical field of talking to other people who researched this, and I just loved it. And I got involved with a few other people through Facebook groups and things like that, and eventually started the podcast, started the YouTube channel, where I just wanted to talk about Billy all the time. So why not bring other folks in?
And that's great because, like I said, it's really keeping everything alive because you know that's how they used to do history was you just passed it down from member family to family, person to person, storytelling and stuff like that. And of course things get bigger along the way, the whole Whopper story where the fish was like 2 inches and then by the time it got
Hmm.
done it was like a 4 foot monster. And I feel that that happens a lot with people from the West. And,
Yes.
Billy specifically is one, Jesse James is another. And like I said, I'm from an area that is heavy with Jesse James lore because I'm in the part of Iowa that is just like right on the Iowa Missouri border. And so it there's a bank probably an hour away from me that still has a big old placard that says Jesse James robbed this bank in whatever year it happened. And so, but there's all kinds of stories in that. And Billy's always interested me, and Young Guns helped out. And the books, I was hoping to find it before we recorded, but I must have misplaced it in my hoards. I One of the first books, obviously for me, was the Pat Garrett, Ash Upton, authentic life of Billy the Kid, and you know the really the lore of it all. I didn't do the deep dive into it until later, like kind of like you said with the pandemic with you, but mine was more like when I hit college, when I was living in the dorms more and I was able to read a little bit more with stuff where I didn't know the full story of like the Lincoln County War. And so I knew about Billy, I knew his involvement in there, and but a lot of my stuff either came from the Authentic Life or it came from Young Guns and Young Guns 2. And kind of like you were saying with your experience with Young Guns 2, I didn't know there was a first one until years later and got to watch and everything. But that's great. So now you guys do have the Billy the Kid Coalition. When did that start coming around?
I'm pretty sure it was established and formed in 2021. So around the time that I'm getting into Billy the Kid and getting interested, this new group is forming, and the nucleus of the group uh, is comprised of two brothers, Josh and Jeremiah Slatton, and their idea was to take real world action and preserving this history and making sure it's handed down and uh, this to a new generation and that it's not lost. So many things about this history are already lost, and there's so many things that when we research a certain topic within this history, we find an aspect of it that we think if someone would have done this just 20 years ago, we would have been able to get information that's lost to us now because certain people have died and things like that. So the idea behind the coalition was to form a nonprofit that did its best to mark these sites, to preserve the memories and the histories through academic pursuits and also real world stuff. And so many projects include things like marking graves. A lot of these people, key players in the story of Billy the Kid, have been buried with no headstone for, a century, over a century. And so that's been a big project. Marking sites. We just marked Stinking Spring, where Pat Garrett captured Billy the Kid and his three companions. And that place has been lost twice to history, and it's never been marked. There's never been a marker there. So luckily, the owner, it's on private property, and the owner was gracious enough to let us mark that. So things like that, just making sure that the sites are not lost and forgotten, and any kind of real world work that we can do. We're not just hemmed in by marking things or just anything that presents itself that we can get behind. We're all about.
Yeah, and that's great. I know that you guys also did the what was it? You got a stone for Bob Ollinger, There was, didn't you guys get like a placard for the Ellis house? And
Well, one of our board members, Amy Ellis, Amy Ellis, that's funny. Amy Gauthier, she just moved to Lincoln and bought the Ellis house. So one of our board members owns the Ellis house and lives there. And we are going to be marking it in September. We're having a little convention down there. We've invited all of our members to come out who are able, and we're going to have a little ceremony and mark it. But yeah, we're excited about that. Ollinger, I don't think we've placed a stone for Bob. But the issue with Bob is that no one's really been aware of where he was buried for a long time. He was buried initially in Fort Stanton Cemetery, along with Charlie Crawford and Bob Beckwith. And so Bob Beckwith was shot at the burning of McSween's house. Crawford was shot shortly before that. They called him Lolly Cooler Crawford. He was from Iowa. And uh,
sounds like it.
Ollinger, of course, was killed April 28th, 1881. So those guys were buried at Fort Stanton, and nothing is marked. It's kind of a sparse cemetery now. The thing is, around 1898, the Army moved all of those bodies to the National Cemetery in Santa Fe. Well, in doing so, they dug up those three guys as well who were not soldiers, and we've located them on the roster. They fit the descriptions, because they made a roster of everyone they moved, and so you see
Right.
these three guys, unknown white civilian, and so comparing them with everybody else and ruling out everybody else, we found these guys plots at the Santa Fe Cemetery. So one project is to get those graves marked as soon as possible.
And that's good. That's good. From personal experience, you know, there's a cemetery where my mom has some relative. I think it was like her 2 times great grandfather and 3 times great grandfather, who were both Civil War vets that were buried on their own property. But then when the property sold to private people, the stones all got knocked over and they're just a pile sitting there. And it's like, well,
Wow.
yeah, it's really sad and all that stuff. So to see that you guys are able to do that work and find that stuff and try to get, you know, give them their proper due. Although we'll get into a little bit of Ollinger a little bit later, but he sounds like he was a piece of work. So
Yeah, and we'll get into it. I'm kind of on the fence about it. I'm probably the only person in Billy Land that's on the fence about it. But yeah, and you mentioned genealogy, and that's really one of the things that appealed to me about the coalition, because genealogy for my own life and my own personal history has been almost sacred in its, in how I approach it, and its rewards, and just remembering my ancestors. So marking graves and visiting graves and just researching that history has always been borderline a sacred experience for me personally. And so when I saw a group that was doing that historically, in a wider on a wider platform of American history and not just personal family history, I really wanted to be a part of it, because I got on board right when they were marking the grave of Jim Carlisle, who was shot at the Great House Tavern. If you watch Young Guns 2, it's the guy that's pushed out of the door and then his own posse shoots him. And so that was what got me on board. But we've marked Chavez's grave, even Jose Chavez, who was a prominent regulator, didn't have a headstone.
yeah, it's well, and like you said, once people that know the stories and that start passing, then it starts getting lost to history, and
Yeah.
that's the sad part. And I agree with you that with the genealogy stuff, I've done it for the longest time, and I've been able to trace both, many branches of my family trees throughout stuff. So, and you always, when you hear a name that's familiar, like, I wonder if we're related to that, because I
Yeah.
just finished James Mills' Bandito Simpatico on
Simpatico.
Audible.
Hmm.
Yeah, and one of the names that kept popping up was a LaRue. Well, my grandmother's mother, her maiden name was LaRue. So it's like, I
Hmm.
wonder, just sitting here wondering, is that possible? And I'm not sure. but that would be something I would have to dig down into and all that stuff, because there's
Maybe
LaRues all
so.
over the place. And then the other one that that jumped off to me was, there was a teacher that Billy had when he was younger that came from England, whose last name was Richards.
Yeah.
And that my dad's grandma's maiden name was Richards, and they came from Wales. So it's like,
Oh,
that makes you wonder on that stuff. And that's part of the reason why the genealogy thing, and then getting into some of these people, really sparked my attention with it. And so it's great to hear that stuff. But you know, I know with your genealogy work, you've been trying to figure out the great mystery of Billy the Kid, and that is where he came from.
yeah.
And I know with all the books and that everybody has wrote, and the stories that have been told, they say New York, and his mother was and was from Ireland, and all that stuff. With your research so far, what have you kind of pinpointed with? And obviously, you're not going to get much, but what have you been able to kind of discertain with what you've been kind of seeing?
Well, it's really cool that you bring that up because the genealogy aspect of the kid's origins is one of the things when I started researching for this quote novel I was going to write. The genealogy and coming across the statement that said nobody knows really where the kid is from. I thought I've done a lot of genealogy and records in the 1860s are pretty good, if you're comparing it to like the 1830s or something. They've got to know where he came from. There's just no way. And so that moment of me saying there's got to be a way to tell where he's from kind of flipped the switch from prospective novel writer to researcher, just avid researcher, because I just was not going to give up on this. And I still don't plan on giving up. But the answer is, after 5 years or so of researching it, and many more years on the parts of other people, that nothing definitively can be said about where he's from. I can tell you where I think he's from and why. And my answer is I do think he was born in New York. I think they moved to Indiana. I think his father died in New York in around 1863. And he and his mother and his brother went to Indiana. I think that Well, I'll tell you why I think that first. First off, he had a brother. Billy the Kid had a brother named Joe. And all of
Right.
Joe's life, he went by Joe Antrim. So that's kind of how I refer to him, even though Billy and Henry. So Billy the Kid's real name was Henry. I'll try to remember in case I'm speaking to someone who's listening to this that doesn't know much about Billy. I'll try to give a little backstory. Billy the Kid went by William H. Bonney. His real name was Henry McCarty, that we know for sure. That's all we know, Henry McCarty. And when his mother later married a man named William Antrim, he took the name Antrim. So Henry Antrim. And when he got into trouble with the law a few years down the line, he started going by William H. Bonney. And so you'll hear a lot of people say that his name was William H. Bonney. But as far as we know, his real name was Henry McCarty. So Billy had a brother named Joe McCarty. When their mother married William Antrim, Joe kept the Antrim name the rest of his life, Joe Antrim. So a lot of people will say that William Antrim was a bad stepfather and that he was abusive and that just say terrible things about him they have no evidence for. But I like to think that since Joe kept that Antrim name his whole life, that maybe William Antrim wasn't as bad as people say he is. But anyway, Joe Antrim on the census records throughout his life, he died in 1930, consistently stated he was born in New York. So I think that I presuppose that Henry, Billy the Kid, was older than Joe. So I believe that Henry and Joe were both born in New York. William Antrim, Billy's stepfather, tried to get a Civil War pension in around 1915. On his application, he states, I've been married just once. She died in the 1870s. she was married once before to a husband who died in New York City, who had no military service that he knew of. So I place Billy the Kid's dad as dying in New York. I say around 1863 because Billy the Kid rode with this guy who was also a regulator, part of Billy's faction in the Lincoln War. His name was George Coe, and George wrote a memoir in around late 20s, early 30s, and he was quoted in a newspaper saying that me and Billy had a lot in common. One of the things that we had in common was both our dads died when we were 4. So the traditional date of birth for Billy, at least as far as the year goes, is about 1859 to 1860. That would place the dad's death around 1863. And if the dad had no military service, then it's very possible that he may have been involved somehow in the New York draft riots, which happened in July of 1863. In one census record, Billy's brother Joe said that he was born in April of 1863, which would mean that he never met his father if his father died in the draft riots. But there's no proof that the father was in the draft riots. That's just something, a neat little kind of coincidence I've come across. And that's all you're going to get with Billy the Kid is suppositions and kind of like inferences. And I always like to stipulate that. But anyway, they were born in New York, in my opinion. They went to Indiana. That's fairly established that they had an Indiana presence. His mother, Catherine McCarty, shows up in 1866 in the Indianapolis City Directory. Now, what I find interesting is a month after Billy was killed in July of 1881, in August, the sheriff in Terre Haute, Indiana, was quoted in an article saying, I remember Billy the Kid when he lived here. He lived in Terre Haute, but his mother lived in Indianapolis. And I found that uh, my companion in the coalition, Jeremiah, he disagrees with me here, but I really think that this is legitimate and that this is an authentic memory because a month out from his death is a little too quick for post-death legends to be forming, and they hadn't even released his whole name yet. And so this sheriff in Terre Haute had to have some idea of who Billy was before it got released in the press, because all they were saying in the press was his name was McCarthy. So this sheriff knew it was a kid named McCarty whose mother lived in Indianapolis and who he had arrested a little bit as a young kid in Terre Haute. So that's a very telling placement that we can place Billy in Terre Haute, his mom in Indianapolis, and then sometime around 1870, she hooks up with William Antrim in a platonic way. I don't mean she hooked up with him, but she aligns her trajectory with William Antrim, and they move to Wichita.
We
So
really are
Wichita
digging
is
into
just
some
on its
deep dives.
yeah. So, yeah, so they moved to Wichita, Kansas, and then they take off after that, after a couple years there to New Mexico. But yeah, so it's all circumstantial. So many people said Billy was from New York and that Billy told him that. He could have been lying for sure. But William Antrim says in 1915 that his deceased wife had a husband before him who died in New York. Joseph Antrim says he was born in New York in every census he gives. So like there's just a lot of New York tossed around there for me to discredit it. And I'm sure there's more that I'm forgetting because this is just off the cuff. I don't have any records in front of me, but so yeah, New York to Indiana to Kansas to New Mexico. That's the general outline of Billy's travels.
Now, I know, and for those that are listening that might not know, they really didn't keep great birth certificate records at those
Right.
times. It was kind of hit or miss. But beings that, and this is from my understanding of things, and I could be, talking to an expert on this, you might know a little bit more about it than I do on it. I want to say that they said that Catherine was a bit of a religious person. Would it be possible to that she would have had both uh, well, at the time, young Henry and Joe, baptized, would it be possible to try figuring out maybe, okay, well, they could have lived in this district. This would have probably been the
Mhm.
nearest church. Maybe there would be some kind of baptismal records for these two.
Yeah,
Or is that
I would
something
hope
you've
so.
tried?
Well, I haven't really tried to access the records that aren't digitally available. Um, and if they were Catholic, then there would be more chance of there being some kind of digital availability.
Right.
But I kind of suspect that Catherine was Presbyterian. I don't know how religious she was, but I think she was a little religious enough to uh, that right when Billy died, there was an article that popped up, and it said it was written by the editor of the paper, and he said, "We still remember Billy when he was a promising young man who could, quote, recite the entire Ten Commandments and a couple other religious things." So it kind of implied that perhaps Billy and Joe might have got some religious education in addition to going to school in Silver City. And even in Terre Haute, that might have been why Billy was in Terre Haute and the mom in Indianapolis. Maybe she enrolled him in school there. But it is
Or is
entirely
it possible
possible if
maybe
they were
she
devout
had
pres.
is it possible maybe that they had some kind of family down in Terre Haute that, while
Yeah,
Catherine was trying to get established, that they could have, said, "Hey, can you watch the kids while I try setting up house
yeah,
up here?"
absolutely. And I've scoured the records for McCarty's. I did find one that was really interesting. There's a guy named I think it's Jeremiah McCarty or James J. McCarty, who is on the 1860 census or 1870 census. He's married to a woman named Cornelia McCarthy, right? Or McCarty. And the interesting thing is this James McCarty was born in Indiana and had lived in Indiana. I mean, born in Indiana, census locations in Indiana. But Cornelia and her son Henry only show up on this one census. And she's married to this James McCarty. And it says that she was born in New York and Henry was born in New York. And so if James is in born in Indiana and on every census in Indiana, how did this New York born mother and son end up there living with him? And this is in the area of Terre Haute and Vigo County. So it's very interesting, but it seems like, according to all the records I've looked at, that this Cornelia died just a few years after that census, right? And so, and this Henry might be one that pops up in further subsequent censi. How would you pluralize census? But anyway, I
I
don't
just
know.
throw
But
the
they
extra
show
S's
up.
on there.
So I've kind of ruled them out, but it's always a puzzle in my head. Like, are they connected somehow? Did Catherine have these McCarty connections from New York to Indiana? It's fascinating, and I know a lot of listeners might not know anything about Billy, and we kind of get into the weeds, and it's so easy for me to forget. Like, hey, let me just dive into this, like 7 years of research and skip all the basics for these listeners who might not know. But what are you gonna do? Like Tony Soprano says.
Well, I will almost say that, most of the listeners of this show usually are just NFL fans, football fans, Green Bay Packer fans. So I'm hoping to give them at least a little education on stuff because, like I
Yeah,
said, this is the off season. There's not much to talk about. So now there's obviously the elephant in the room with Bonnie,
yeah.
and I know when I was listening to this simpatico that was it Nolan that came up with the theory that Bonnie could possibly be Catherine's maiden name, and that they supposedly found a couple of Bonnies over in Ireland, and obviously there's the famous pirate Anne Bonny that
Right.
that was Irish and all that.
Yeah.
But is that a possibility, or are you of the opinion that that was just a like a pen name that the kid was kind of trying to take?
So again, there's no really way to be aggressively right or wrong about this. but I've seen no evidence to indicate that Bonnie was in any way a family name. So the only time Catherine shows up on record, she's Catherine McCarty, widow of Michael. And so we just don't know what her maiden name was. I lean in the direction of Billy just taking Bonnie because he liked it or saw it somewhere, but I could be wrong, and it could be Catherine's maiden name. There's just no records that tell us one way or the other. So you just kind of got to pick which one you want to lean towards and hope you have some good reasons why. In this case, I don't really have any good reasons other than I haven't seen any reason to suspect it's a family name, but there's very little out there.
Right. And, this is all guesswork. And until that day that somebody invents a time machine and we can actually go back and visit some of
Right,
these spots, that's where we're at. It just, like you said, they don't just pop out of nowhere. Somebody's,
right.
there's information somewhere that, maybe one of these days the coalition can fund the trip to Ireland and you guys can scour the stuff over there for it. But because you got to think that there's
Absolutely.
at least a county over there that lays claim to, well, maybe this is we're the county that popped out, Billy the Kid or whatever.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I
so
mean, that's the problem. I mean, it's just the amount of funding this stuff takes because that's why when you asked me
right,
about the one thing, I was like, well, only digitally have I looked at these records because there's even digitally, the memberships that we have to pay to sites like
exactly,
Ancestry and newspapers and all these archives, it's absurd, honestly. And then when it comes to all of the real world travel that would need to be done, the answer to these questions might be in a library somewhere in a collection of interviews that researchers have already done on Billy the Kid and just nobody's looked at because it's like these researchers from the 40s and 50s they die and they leave all of their collections to these libraries and one researcher will go in there in maybe the 60s and get the info they want and then that research is just copied and copied and copied and nobody goes back to the original documents and looks through every box and
right.
that's how it is and so the answer may already have been discovered and just lost again.
And let's face it, we're in the day and age where unless you can type it into Google search bar and pop it up, nobody wants to do the legwork with it, and
Yeah.
that's the hard part about it. So Billy and family end up in New Mexico.
Hmm.
They obviously Catherine dies of, at the time it's called consumption, but we know it
Yeah.
as tuberculosis, which is horrible. If anybody is an Old West fan, that they know that's the famous disease that Doc Holliday was suffering through and all that stuff. And so you got to believe that hit the family hard. And
Hmm.
we know that William Antrim, Billy and Joe's stepfather, said, I don't want to deal with the kids, so I'm going to leave them, with people that Catherine kind of had been friendly with down there. And Billy is pretty much left, you know, to his own devices with, but it sounded like that he at least got along with the people that he was supposed to live with. It wasn't until he started kind of getting in trouble that they said, "All right, well, you gotta you gotta move on because we're not kind of going to deal with that stuff." But and really, this is just a quick overview of years of stuff with Billy that or not years, but at least hundreds of stories that can be told with it. But
Mm.
let's go up to Billy's first crime. When do we start finding out Billy? It let's not say troublemaker because like I said, he's
Right.
had some stuff with him, but when does Billy start towing the unlawful line?
Right. Well, I'll say this that pretty much everybody who knew Billy personally liked him. You will rarely find any firsthand account of people that knew Billy that say that they didn't like him or that he wasn't a charming, almost good person, which is really odd for an outlaw. Even Pat Garrett, when he killed him, seemed really, really sorry about it and spoke up for his good character. It was really weird. So it's odd. You kind of think of this kid who, Catherine, his mother, died in 1874. He was about 14, and the frontier world of the 1800s it's merciless. And William Antrim, I can't say if he was a good man or a bad man, but he was certainly ill suited to be a stepfather. And he certainly farmed his kids out, Joe and Henry, to whoever would take him in town. And the people that took him have good memories of Billy. The one guy, it may have been Richard Knight or the Truesdells, they said he was a good worker, that all the other boys stole, but Henry never stole, and things like that. But somehow Billy got tied up with this guy named George Schaefer, who went by the name of Sombrero Jack. And this is a year after his mother died in Silver City. And Sombrero Jack stole some laundry and a couple revolvers from this Chinese laundry. And there was a lot of Chinese immigration in the area. And so a lot of people looked at Chinese folks as kind of like second class citizens at the time. And if you read the newspaper article, it indicates that this guy, Charlie's son, was kind of like one of the Chinese immigrants who had assimilated into Western culture. He'd lost his Asian wardrobe and things like that. So they stole this laundry and these guns from Charlie's son, this Chinese immigrant launderer. And it doesn't sound like a lot now, but back then that's a lot of money. These fine clothes, these shirts, the revolvers alone were probably worth a pretty penny. And
Yeah.
apparently George Schaefer just asked Billy to stash some of the loot. So Billy was living with a woman named Mrs. Brown at the time. She was running a boarding house, and he just put him in his trunk in his room. And Snoopy Mrs. Brown came in one day and found him. Just opened the trunk and saw the guns and everything. Or he may have been wearing a new shirt. Who knows? Maybe she got suspicious. But anyway, Sombrero Jack took off. He left town. So that just left Billy with this stolen laundry. So Billy's first real crime on record is stealing laundry. And the sheriff at the time was a guy named Harvey Whitehill. And he took Henry and he put him in the Silver City jail, which, it's not this huge penitentiary. It's just a small jail, couple cells, a hallway to walk down, sturdy door that they put in and bragged about, that no one was escaping from this little jail they built. And Whitehill even said he had gotten onto Henry Billy before for stealing butter. So Billy was showing some signs of petty theft, but nothing too bad. But Whitehill later said he put Henry in jail for stealing the laundry just to scare him. But in Henry's mind, in Billy the Kid's young mind, he's in jail for theft, and the district court is coming to town soon, so he's got maybe a month or so to just languish in jail, which is not a good prospect. And then once court is held, you're looking at maybe they'll send you to the penitentiary in Leavenworth or something. You just don't know and what's going on in his head. So Billy is a small kid. He's always remarked upon as being very small for whatever age he is. So he turns on his charm and he convinces Sheriff Whitehill to let him. When Whitehill leaves for the day, he asks him just to lock the door, unlock Billy's cell, and let him walk the hallway so Billy can get some exercise. So Whitehill agrees. Whitehill doesn't think, you can't escape through this door, this huge door we've got put in here. The bar's on the window. There's no way the kid's getting out. So he agrees. He unlocks the cell that Billy's in and says, okay, once I shut this front door, you can walk the hallway or whatever. So, and there's a fireplace there in the jail. And so, night comes on and Billy squirms his way up that fireplace. And when when Whitehill and his jailer come back the next day and see Billy gone, uh, they're looking around outside, and there's this Mexican, sheep herder or something. He's like, "Who are you looking for?" Whitehill says, "This kid escaped." He said, "Yeah, he climbed through the chimney. He was covered in soot, and he took off that way." So uh, it was a small chimney, according to Whitehill, but the kid was wiry enough to get up it. And that was his first entry into crime. And he probably still would have been all right, but in his young mind, that was a serious offense. He was now a jailbreak kid. He was a convict on the run, and he took off to Arizona. And that was the start of his journey into outlawry, just stealing some
It's
clothes.
crazy. Well, and he didn't even really steal them. It was the other guy that stole them, and he was just aiding and abetting.
That's exactly what the paper said. That even the newspapers knew it. When they reported it, they said it was Jack that done the stealing, and the kid was just holding it. And Jack is skinned out, is what they said. So yeah, he was just a dumb kid accomplice, and Whitehill's probably telling the truth. He was probably just gonna scare the kid straight, but Billy was like, they're gonna hang me. I've got to get out of here.
Well, and I'm sure hanging around a guy like Sombrero Jack really didn't help him in that sense because, hey, we can't get caught with this because this is going to happen. So, make sure you're hiding this good. And,
Right.
but it also, not to get into the psychology of things too much, because obviously I'm not a psychologist or anything, but, looking through a lot of the kid's history just looks like he's looking for that I don't want to say father figure, but that figure in his life
Yeah.
that he can pattern himself after. And
Yeah.
it just seems like he ran into the wrong, instead of shadowing Whitehill, he shadows Jack. So, it's one of those things that what's the poem, the two roads diverge,
Yeah.
and which one are you going to take, and he just ended up taking the wrong one. So
You know,
we know,
that's a good observation. If you look at the rest of his life, he seems to be doing that his whole life
yeah,
until he's just left alone because the next guy he pals up with is Johnny Mackey, who's a horse thief, and then he gets scared out of Arizona and he teams up with Jesse Evans, and then that goes sour, and then he finally teams up with someone who could teach him a thing or two, John Tunstall, and Tunstall gets killed, and then from then on out, he's just on his own. So that's a good analogy.
so now I'm kind of jumping around here because, like I said, this is just going to be an abridged version of events.
Yeah,
But we know his first kill is Wendy Cahill, who was a bully, and that
yeah.
that's really what sent him down the road. How old is Billy at the time of his first kill?
He's about 16. Yep. And
Yeah.
and
So
this is in Camp Grant, Arizona. It's near a military post, and he's a known horse thief at this time. Him and his pal Johnny Mackey have been stealing horses, and he's gotten in trouble a couple times. So he's definitely an outlaw. He's a horse thief and a gambler. And there's this place called Atkins Cantina, and the kid would go there and deal money and just have a good time. And there was this guy named Frank Cahill. Apparently he was called Wendy Cahill, and for just running his mouth. And he was a big, blustery kind of guy. And there's a few different variations in the story, but basically, Cahill just comes in and is messing with Billy and just bullying him physically. And they get into it, call each other names, and then they take it outside. And then right outside of Atkins Cantina, Cahill just pins Billy to the ground and just starts beating him. And Billy pulls his gun and shoots Cahill in the gut and takes off, just runs. And so Cahill dies the next day. So he's got time to tell folks what happened, talk about it, dictate his will and all that. But they seem to blame Billy. The newspapers say there was a coroner's jury called and it was determined to be unjustified homicide, which is odd because it's clearly in nearly all accounts basically, it's self-defense. So
right.
it's odd. You have to kind of surmise maybe they had something against Billy, or maybe he ran prematurely and would have got off, but it's just hard to say.
And you never know back then, the right people could get into, the right friends of Cahill could have said this, or
Yeah.
hey, it wasn't like it is now where we have, there'd have been a half a dozen people with their camera phones out recording
Yeah.
the whole situation.
Well, and that's
So
that's the thing. In 1875, 2 years before that, Billy's friend Johnny Mackey. This is a guy, Billy's partner in crime with this Johnny Mackey guy. Johnny Mackey was playing poker in 1875, and this much larger guy started running his mouth at Johnny, and they got into it. And the guy stood up from the poker table and approached Johnny, and Johnny pulled his pistol and shot the guy through the throat. And fairly certain the guy survived, but Johnny was arrested and went to trial for it. And they let him off, and the judge said even though the other bigger guy was unarmed and Johnny shot him in the throat, the guy was so much bigger and so much of a threat to Johnny that it was self-defense. And it's almost the exact same situation Billy went through 2 years later, but for some reason, in Billy's case, it was determined to be just unjust, murder. And you have to wonder, was Cahill just really respected by the right people in town?
right. And that's another thing that seems to go against Billy's favor later on in life too, is that the
Yeah.
right people were in the right power that really hindered him. So, kind of jumping ahead here, we know. Well, just to go back a little bit, after, if I remember right from the simpatico, uh, Billy actually goes to find his stepfather in Arizona and tells him what happens. And Antrim's like,
Yeah.
no, get the hell away from me. You've got too much heat on you. So you wonder about the relationship there where, okay, well, there might have been that strain of a relationship where, most of the time if there was a good relationship, okay, you did, maybe we need to get you hit out here or go to Mexico or go here or go here. He was just plain like, no, get the hell away from me. There's too much heat on you.
Well, this is actually a great illustration of what it's like to do Billy history, because number one, we don't know for sure that he visited Antrim. So even
Okay.
that's up in the air. But if he did, there are two versions of how that went down. So in the one version, Billy visits him like in Georgetown or something, and Antrim says, "Well, if that's the kind of boy you are, I don't want anything to do with you. Get out of here." And in another version, Antrim gives him some cash and says, "This is all I have. Good luck to you." So like, you've got an event that you don't even know happened, but if it did, you've got two outcomes, and that basically sums up all of Billy history when you try to study it.
Okay, well, and see, you just gave me a little bit more information to it. So, that's, that helps my case with it too. So, but that's still kind of interesting that either, if you go by either story, it's still all right. Well, just get the hell away from me.
Right. Yeah, and if
Um,
Antrim was such a bad stepdad, why did Billy go to him in the first place? That's interesting too.
right. And it might have been just that he was hoping to find a place to lay low for a while.
Right.
And, that would have been, I think at the time they said Antrim was mining. So, a miner's
Hmm.
camp is kind of an easy way to get lost in because
Yeah.
everybody's, uh, so we jump ahead a little bit and Billy's just kind of doing his thing, with the horse Steven and palling around and
Yeah.
all that. And you mentioned that he kind of teams up with, or gets involved with this John Tunstall.
Yeah.
And I what I'm going to let you tell it. What's the biggest myth about the John Tunstall Billy the Kid relationship?
Well, it's always a mentor, older mentor, young, you know, mentee, young student, and that's just not the case. Tunstall was he was in his 20s, so when Billy got hooked up with Tunstall, he was not in his 40s or 50s like you'll see in shows and movies. Tunstall was a guy from England, big businessman. He had a rich dad who funded all of his stuff, and he came over, essentially ended up in Lincoln, New Mexico. His goal was to start a ranch, a store, a bank, and basically gain a monopoly on Lincoln County. That put him in direct opposition to a guy named Lawrence Murphy and his uh, Padawan, Jimmy Dolan. And so it basically, Jimmy Dolan and Lawrence Murphy already had a monopoly on the county. And so here comes this Englishman who wants to get his own hand on it. So that's where the conflict comes in. The issue is Murphy and Dolan were crooks. They were cruel uh, holders of monopoly. They that sounds like I'm talking about the game. They were cruel. They had a tight grip on Lincoln, right? Tunstall would have started a monopoly. He was I gotta stop saying that word. It starts to sound weird the more you say it. But Tunstall was he was not a noble guy. A lot of times in the movie, he's painted as just an honest, good old businessman. And in a sense, he
Typical
was.
English
But in another
gentleman.
sense, yeah. But in another sense, he was a capitalist. He came here to make money and make as much as he could at the expense of other people. He still would have exploited people. Just he would have exploited them within the law, which was a huge progression in the right direction from Murphy. So he wasn't like an altruistic, compassionate savior of Lincoln County. He once told his dad, "I want to make 50 cents off of every dollar spent in Lincoln." So like that's quite a profit. I mean, this guy wanted to make money, but he would not have been sinister like Murphy was. Murphy conned the people out of money and he skirted the law. He was the law, you know. So there's that. The myth that Tunstall was this benevolent chap who came in and was just gonna get set things decent, but then also the myth that he was this older mentor. He never mentions Billy in his letters back home, even though he mentions tons of other people. So we don't even know how often or how close he and Billy were. But at the very least, Billy had found some honest work. And he definitely found some good friends in Dick Brewer and Fred Waite and other people who became regulators along with him. So he did have good influences. He had good mentors who were showing him the ropes, and he may have gone straight if things had turned out different.
And pretty much what happens is, this is where I say that the reason I like Young Guns and Young Guns 2 a lot more is they stuck to the story a little bit more often. Yeah, things got a
Mm.
little out there with the way they did it, but the next thing we know, Tunstall's getting murdered by a posse of men that were basically working for Murphy and Dolan and all those. And I appreciate you
Yeah,
throwing out the Padawan there for Dolan. So
that's what I can do.
Um, so now we get into really the big lore of Billy the Kid, because this is pretty much what makes, and really he's not going as Billy the Kid at this time. That becomes, let's would you say it was more of a literary thing that Billy the Kid was, because he tended to be going more like Kid Antrim or just
Yeah.
the Kid. It wasn't until like
Yeah.
more towards the end of his life that he was known as, quote, Billy the Kid.
Well, what's funny is I would wager that he was never known as Billy the Kid to his friends or himself. And yes, you're correct. When he first came to town, he was Kid Antrim, and that's what he was called in Arizona, Kid Antrim. And then as he assumed his William H. Bonney name, it became the Kid. You know, people just called him Kid. And when they started calling him Billy, I think it's my claim, and I think I can back this up. Actually, explicitly back this up with a conversation that's recorded. But I think people called him Billy Kid. What's up, Billy Kid? There is no the. It's just Billy Kid. So much so that I think some people misidentified his last name as Kid, Kidd. But
Possible.
there's actually, and I'm jumping ahead in the story, but they have this military inquiry where they look into the actions of this guy named Colonel Dudley, and they call all these witnesses, and they call everybody that was in the Lincoln War to give testimony, and they call William H. Bonney. And so we have on record transcribed the conversation between Bonnie and Dudley and others when he's on the stand. And Colonel Dudley asked him, "Are you known as Billy Kid?" And he said, "Yeah." And then, like 2 questions later, he says, "Are you known as Billy the Kid?" And he said, "I've already answered this. I'm known as I'm known as Billy Kid, but not Billy the Kid." And so he spells it out crystal clear right there in his own words. So that's actually something we have from the lips of the kid himself, about what he's called and how he's addressed. But Billy the Kid was basically a creation of the press around 1880, when he started getting headlines and they started sensationalizing his story. They dubbed him Billy the Kid, and it stuck, and it's still with us.
Do you think possibly that if he was going by Billy Kid, that could fit into the whole pirate motif with the William Bonney, Billy Kid type thing?
I wondered because Captain Kidd, I think, was a big. I think even people remember him reading Captain Kidd dime novels. So I think it definitely there could be some crossover there. That maybe he was going by Billy Kid, and it became the Kid. It's really hard to say.
Because I do remember from the Simpatico that, one of his favorite things to do when he was a kid was play pirates. And
Yes,
it would just make sense that he just started pulling these pirate names out
right.
and
I
and
mean, that
and
gives you
saying,
two
all right,
names. You've got the pirate and Bonnie, and then you've got Captain Kidd. So you've got
yep.
William H. Bonney, the Kid. It's like, come on.
Green Bay hustle, grind it up. Hit the field, we don't bluff. Touchdown dances, feel the love. Jordan's got that MVP stuff. It's time for the up. Let's go. Packers bringing that show. It's time for you know who. Wanna go, go.